The town of Blackridge had a silence that felt unnatural, as if even the wind knew better than to linger. People spoke in hushed tones, doors shut early, and strangers were measured not by their names, but by how long they survived the town's unspoken rules. At the center of all that fear stood one man, Elias Varn. No one knew when he had first arrived, only that he had always been there, watching, existing, untouched. He lived at the edge of town in a decaying house that overlooked everything like a warning. Children were told not to go near him. Grown men crossed the street if they saw him coming. And women? They pretended he didn't exist at all. No one spoke to him. No one dared. Except Mara Ellery. Mara had arrived only weeks ago, inheriting her late grandmother's bookstore, a quiet place filled with dust and forgotten stories. Unlike the others, she noticed things. The way people stiffened when Elias walked past, the way conversations died mid-sentence, the way even the town's bravest avoided saying his name. Curiosity burned in her like fire. She asked questions, but answers came wrapped in warnings. "Leave it alone," they said. "He's not someone you involve yourself with." But Mara wasn't built for fear. She was built for truth. And the more she saw Elias, from a distance, standing alone, silent, untouched, the more she realized something didn't add up. Monsters didn't walk like that. They didn't carry pain in their eyes. The first time Mara saw him up close, the world seemed to hold its breath. It was late afternoon, golden sunlight cutting through the narrow street as she stepped out of her bookstore. And there he was, tall, still, dressed in dark clothes that seemed untouched by time. His presence alone shifted the air, like something ancient and heavy had entered the moment. People nearby suddenly found reasons to leave. A cart was abandoned. A conversation ended mid-laugh, but Mara didn't move. Their eyes met. For a second, just a second, she saw it. Not danger, not cruelty, something else, something broken. Elias looked away first, turning as if her gaze itself had crossed a line. He began to walk past her, silent as always when she spoke. "Why does everyone fear you?" The question echoed louder than it should have. A man across the street dropped what he was holding. Someone whispered, "She shouldn't have said that." Elias stopped. The entire street froze. He didn't turn immediately. Seconds stretched into something unbearable. When he finally did, his eyes locked onto hers again, but this time, they were colder, guarded. "Because they should," he said quietly. And then he walked away. That should have been enough. It would have been enough for anyone else. But Mara wasn't like the others in Blackridge. Fear didn't silence her. It sharpened her resolve. That night, she couldn't sleep. His words replayed in her mind, not as a warning, but as a challenge. Because beneath them, she heard something else. Not pride, not threat, regret. The next few days, she watched him, not in a strange way, but in a careful, observant one. He never spoke to anyone, never lingered, never caused trouble. And yet, the town treated him like a storm waiting to break. She asked again, this time pushing harder. Old shopkeepers avoided her. A bartender refused to answer. One elderly woman simply whispered, "People died," before refusing to say more. But something about that didn't sit right. If he was dangerous, why was he always alone? If he was cruel, why did his eyes look like they carried guilt? And that's when the idea came to her. A reckless, impossible idea that would either break the town or break her. She would speak to him again. Not just speak, She would change everything. The rumor spread before she even acted. Mara Ellery was going to confront Elias Varn again. In a town where people avoided even saying his name, that alone was enough to shake something loose. By the time she stepped out of her bookstore the next morning, eyes were already watching her, some filled with disbelief, others with pity, a few even with quiet horror. She walked anyway, straight toward the edge of town, toward his house. The closer she got, the quieter everything became. No birds, no wind. Just the sound of her footsteps against dry earth. His home stood like a forgotten memory. Cracked walls, broken windows, a place no one dared approach. She didn't hesitate. She knocked. Silence. For a moment, doubt crept in. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe the stories were. The door opened. Elias stood there, closer than ever before, his presence overwhelming in the narrow frame of the doorway. His expression wasn't angry. It was tired. "You shouldn't be here," he said. Mara took a breath. "I'm not afraid of you." A flicker crossed his face, something between surprise and pain. "You should be." The conversation that followed wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it carried the weight of everything the town had buried. "They say people died," Mara said carefully. Elias didn't deny it. They did. The words were simple, final. But Mara stepped closer instead of back. "Did you kill them?" That question could have ended everything. Elias looked at her for a long time, long enough that most people would have looked away. "I was there," he said. Not a confession, not a denial. Something worse. Mara felt it then, the truth hiding between his words. Not guilt of action, but of consequence. "You're protecting someone," she whispered. That was when his expression changed, not anger, fear. "Leave," he said, sharper now, "before you become part of it too." But Mara didn't leave. Instead, she did something no one in Blackridge had ever done. She smiled and said, "Then I won't leave you alone in it." The town couldn't believe what happened next, because Mara didn't just keep visiting Elias. She stayed. Day after day she returned. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they sat in silence. But slowly, something began to shift. The man no one dared speak to was being seen, and that terrified the town more than anything else. Warnings turned into threats. People told her she was making a mistake, that she didn't understand, that some things were better left buried. But Mara kept going, until one evening, under a sky heavy with storm clouds, she did the unthinkable. In the middle of the town square, in front of everyone, she walked up to Elias, took his hand, and said clearly, "Marry me." The world stopped. No one breathed, no one moved. Because this wasn't just madness. This was defiance. This was war against everything the town believed. And all eyes turned to Elias, waiting for his answer. The silence that followed her words felt louder than any scream. People stared as if reality itself had broken. Some waited for Elias to lash out. Others for Mara to realize what she'd done. But neither happened. Elias didn't pull his hand away. He didn't step back. He simply looked at her. And in that moment, something shifted, not in the town, but in him. For years he had carried their fear, their hatred, their silence. He had accepted it, lived within it, let it define him. But now, someone stood in front of all of it and chose him anyway. "You don't know what you're asking," he said quietly. "I do," Mara replied. "You're not what they say." That was when the whispers began to rise again. She's going to die. He'll ruin her. Stop her. But no one stepped forward, because even now, they were afraid. Elias finally turned, not to Mara, but to the crowd. For the first time in years, he faced them directly, not as a shadow, not as a rumor, but as a man. "You want the truth?" he said. The whispers died instantly. No one had ever heard him speak like this. "They didn't die because of me." Murmurs rippled. "They died because of you." The words hit like a storm. Faces changed. Fear turned into something else. Guilt. "You needed someone to blame," Elias continued, "and I stayed silent because it was easier for you." Mara felt his hand tighten slightly in hers. "They know," she said softly. And for the first time, the town couldn't hide behind silence. Elias looked back at Mara. For a moment, everything else disappeared. The fear, the past, the weight of years, all of it. And then he spoke. 4 words, simple, quiet, but powerful enough to break everything. "I was waiting for you." The entire town fell into stunned silence, because those words didn't just answer her proposal. They revealed everything. He hadn't been hiding from them. He had been enduring them, waiting for someone to see him. And Mara had. That night, Blackridge changed. Not instantly, not completely, but the silence that once protected lies was gone. And for the first time in years, Elias Varn was no longer alone. The words, "I was waiting for you," didn't just silence the town. They cracked something open that could never be sealed again. People who had lived their entire lives hiding behind suspicion and whispered lies suddenly found themselves exposed under a truth they didn't want to face. That night, no one slept easily in Blackridge. Windows stayed shut, but eyes remained open. Mara, however, sat across from Elias inside his worn house, the storm outside finally breaking into heavy rain. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The proposal still hung between them, not as a question anymore, but as something inevitable. Elias wasn't confused. He was afraid, not of Mara, but of what choosing her would unleash. "You don't understand what this will cost you," he finally said, his voice low, almost lost beneath the rain. Mara didn't look away. "I understand enough," she replied, "and I'm still here." That was the moment he realized something dangerous. She wasn't going to leave, no matter how much he tried to protect her from what was coming. The next morning, the town reacted exactly as fear always does, through control. Mara's bookstore was vandalized before sunrise, its windows shattered, shelves overturned. A message was painted across the wall in crude, shaking letters. "Leave him, or leave town." People pretended not to see it. No one stepped forward to help. But when Elias arrived and saw the destruction, something in him shifted, something the town had hoped would never wake again. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply began to fix what was broken. Quietly, methodically, board by board, glass by glass. Mara watched him, realizing this wasn't just kindness, it was restraint. Because the man they feared, he could have burned the entire town down if he wanted to, and yet, he was repairing a bookstore. "Why don't you fight back?" she asked softly. Elias paused, his hands still. "Because the moment I do," he said, "they'll finally be right about me." But the town wasn't finished. Fear doesn't disappear, it escalates. By evening, a group of men gathered near the square, whispering plans they believed justified. They convinced themselves this was necessary, that Elias was a threat that needed to be removed before things got worse. And Mara, She was simply collateral damage in their eyes. But one thing they didn't expect was that Elias already knew. He had always known how this would end. The only difference now was that Mara stood in the middle of it, and for the first time in years, he wasn't willing to walk away. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across Black Ridge, Elias stepped out of his house, not as the man who hid, but as the man they had created. And this time, he wasn't going to stay silent. The confrontation didn't begin with violence. It began with presence. Elias walked into the town square where the men had gathered, their confidence wavering the moment they saw him approach without hesitation. Mara followed behind, refusing to stay hidden. The air was thick with tension, every movement watched, every breath measured. "You should have stayed away," one of the men said, though his voice lacked conviction. Elias didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at each of them, really looked. And one by one, their certainty began to crack. Because deep down, they knew. They remembered what had truly happened years ago. "You're afraid of the truth," Elias finally said. "Not me." That statement landed harder than any threat, because fear thrives on lies, and Elias was dismantling both at once. One man stepped forward, anger masking his unease. "People died because of you," he shouted, desperate to reclaim control. But Elias didn't flinch. "No," he replied calmly. "People died because you made a choice, and I took the blame." The crowd stirred. Eyes shifted. No one wanted to hear this, but they couldn't look away either. Mara felt the weight of the moment, realizing this wasn't just about Elias anymore. This was about the entire town confronting something they had buried for years. "Tell them," she said quietly, standing beside him. Elias hesitated, not because he feared them, but because he knew what the truth would destroy. But then he looked at Mara and chose to speak. "It was the night of the fire," Elias began, his voice steady but heavy. "You locked the doors. You chose who got out and who didn't." The silence that followed was suffocating. Faces turned pale. Some stepped back. Others looked down, unable to meet his gaze. The story they had told themselves, the one where Elias was the villain, was unraveling in real time. And they couldn't stop it. "I stayed," Elias continued, "because someone had to carry what you did." Mara felt her chest tighten. This wasn't just guilt. This was sacrifice twisted into punishment. And now, for the first time, the truth stood exposed in the open, where no one could ignore it anymore. After that night, Black Ridge was no longer the same town. The silence didn't disappear, but it changed. It was no longer protective. It was suffocating. People avoided each other now, not Elias. Doors closed earlier. Conversations ended faster, because the truth had shifted the fear, and now they were afraid of themselves. Mara noticed it immediately. The same people who once whispered about Elias now refused to even look in his direction, not out of hatred, but out of shame. And Elias? He returned to his quiet existence, as if nothing had changed. But Mara knew better. Something inside him had finally broken free, and it couldn't be contained again. Their relationship deepened, not through grand gestures, but through understanding. Elias wasn't easy to love. He carried too much, spoke too little, and trusted almost no one. But Mara didn't need him to be different. She only needed him to be real. And slowly, he began to let her in. Not all at once, not easily, but enough. "Why didn't you leave?" she asked one evening. Elias stared out into the distance. Because if I did, they'd never have to face it, he said. That was who he was. Not a monster, not a victim. Something far more complicated. A man who chose to stay where he was hated, so others couldn't escape their guilt. But peace doesn't last long in places built on broken truths. Because while some in Blackridge began to accept what had happened, others refused. And those people? They were the most dangerous of all. Because they didn't want forgiveness, they wanted control back, and they were willing to destroy anything and anyone to get it, including Mara. It happened without warning. Mara disappeared one evening while closing her bookstore. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, just absence. And in a town like Blackridge, that meant one thing: someone had decided to act. When Elias found out, the calm restraint he had held onto for years finally shattered. This wasn't about the town anymore. This wasn't about guilt or truth. This was about her. And for the first time, Elias stopped holding back. The search was relentless. Elias didn't ask for help. He didn't need to. He knew the town better than anyone. He knew its secrets, its hiding places, its lies, and one by one he tore through them, not with violence, but with certainty. People who had once ignored him now avoided him out of something deeper than fear. Because this time, they weren't looking at a man they had blamed. They were looking at a man who had nothing left to lose. When he finally found her, it wasn't where anyone expected. It was beneath the old town hall, the same place where the fire had started years ago. And standing there were the people who refused to let the past die. "This ends tonight," one of them said. But they didn't realize something important. It already had. Mara wasn't afraid. Even tied, even surrounded, she held on to one certainty: Elias would come. Not because he was powerful, but because he was relentless. And when he stepped into that dark space beneath the town, the air itself seemed to shift. No hesitation, no fear, just purpose. "You should have left," one of them said again. Elias shook his head slightly. "You had your chance," he replied. There was no anger in his voice, and somehow, that made it worse, because anger could be fought. This couldn't. The confrontation didn't last long, not because of violence, but because of truth. Elias didn't expose them again. He didn't need to. They were already undone. And when Mara was finally free, the balance of everything shifted permanently. After that night, the power in Blackridge changed hands, not through force, but through reality. The people who had controlled the narrative were gone, either exposed or broken by their own actions. And for the first time, the town had no one left to blame. Mara stood beside Elias in the square once more, but this time, no one whispered, no one turned away. They simply watched, not with fear, but with something unfamiliar. Respect. "Do you still mean it?" Elias asked quietly. Mara smiled. "I never stopped." And this time, he didn't hesitate. The wedding wasn't grand, it wasn't loud, but it was real. And in a town built on silence, that mattered more than anything. People came, not because they had to, but because they chose to. Elias stood there, no longer the man nobody dared speak to. And Mara? She hadn't just changed his life. She had changed the entire town. And when he finally spoke his vows, they weren't long. They didn't need to be, because some words carry everything.